Where we go from there is a choice I leave to you.
Greetings and welcome back for those of you who have been waiting a long time for this part 2 video. I know this is super late with its arrival, but better late than never, right? So, in the last video, I talked about Abhidharma Buddhist philosophy. If you haven't watched my part 1 video on this series yet, I strongly recommend you do so. Otherwise, this video may not make as much sense. Moving on, I discussed the atomic theories of Abhidharma Buddhism with their explanation of the dharmas, and how these dharmas are a lot like the 0 and 1 codes that are in our computers. I even discussed how Abhidharma Buddhism claims that through meditation, you can see the dharmas, just like how Neo can see the computer codes in the Matrix when he becomes the One. So, the story of the first Matrix movie has a lot of Buddhist symbolism in it. Maybe even more so than Christianity, although there is certainly a lot of Christian symbolism in the Matrix too. However, in the Matrix Reloaded, the Jesus analogy really starts to fall apart when Neo meets the architect, the artificial intelligence who created the Matrix. This scene reveals Neo's identity as the One is not actually a religious prophecy that has come to reality like Morpheus believes that it is. Instead, the function of the One is a determined program from the architect to give the machines an upper hand on the people. It's a long story on why the architect created the fake religion of the One and why this function of the One has to exist, but basically all you need to know is that Neo's not really a hero of the human race, literally. He's not a messiah figure. Therefore, the One is a lie. So this detail really ruins the Jesus Christ symbolisms. Now, I also mentioned in the part 1 video that I think there's possibly some other Buddhist themes going on in the sequel films that may very well be non-Abhidharma Buddhist. In fact, I actually said there might be Mahayana Buddhist themes occurring in these films. One thing that makes me think this is Neo's desire for Trinity. I even said in the part 1 video that there are some Buddhists who seem to think that nirvana can be experienced even for those who are in love with someone else. The specific Buddhist school I'm thinking of in regards to this is a Chinese Buddhist school called Tiantai. But I think in order to more fully appreciate Chinese Tiantai Buddhism, we have to unravel the earlier Mahayana Buddhist schools that came before it. So we'll start first with understanding a school of Indian Mahayana Buddhism called Madhyamaka. Madhyamaka is a Sanskrit word that can be translated into English as the middle way, so from now on I'll refer to this school of Buddhism as the Middle Way Buddhism. The Middle Way Buddhism is basically a school of Buddhism that came after the Abhidharma. And Middle Way Buddhism has some huge disagreements with the Abhidharma. To understand these disagreements between the two, let's consider this passage from one of the early scriptures of Buddhism from the Pali Canon scriptures, which is what the Abhidharma follows. A disciple comes to the Buddha and wants to know what happens to a Buddha after he dies. So the disciple asks some questions and the Buddha replies no to all of them. Is it the case that after death a Buddha exists? No. Is it the case that after death a Buddha does not exist? No. After death, does a Buddha both exist and not exist? No. Is it after death a Buddha neither exists nor ceases to exist? No. Obviously, this back and forth dialogue between the Buddha and the disciple is really confusing. And of course, passages like this one bewildered many Buddhists too. So the Abhidharma came about partly as a project to explain passages like this one. The Abhidharma project was to come up with a positive answer to why the Buddha said no to all four of the disciples' questions. And that positive answer relates back to my part 1 video, which is that the Abhidharma came up with their atomic dharmas theories. Instead of there either being a soul or a person that gets reborn, or nothing that gets reborn at all and just everyone dies when they die, the Abhidharma Buddhists formulated the answer that there are these building block atoms and building block mental aggregates that are involved in the rebirthing process instead of an eternal, unchanging soul or person. So then, we are not souls or persons that go through the rebirthing process. Rather, we're collections of building block parts that go through the rebirthing process. So, Abhidharma Buddhism rejects both the religious soul view and the atheist annihilation at death view. You can think of it like this. Is it a soul or self that goes through the rebirthing process? No. So not a soul? No. Both a soul and not a soul? No. Neither a soul nor not a soul? No. Well, what is it then? It's not a soul or self, but it's the dharmas. But for the middle way Buddhists, they think it's a bad idea to try and figure out what is real and what is unreal. For them, trying to figure out what really exists out there is just a waste of time. And there is truth to this idea for all Buddhists, because in this early Polycanon scripture, the Buddha goes on to use an analogy to explain what it's like to try to answer life's big questions. So the story goes that a man gets shot with a poison arrow, and obviously he has to get the poison arrow out before the poison reaches his organs and kills him. But instead of the man trying to get out the arrow, he just wants to answer life's big questions and then get out the arrow. So the point is that you shouldn't focus on life's big questions only from a philosophical view if you want to become spiritually awakened. So I think here Abhidharma Buddhists and Middle Way Buddhists agree. Where they disagree is that can there be a positive answer through another method, which is meditation? And we will see what the Middle Way Buddhists think about that. For the Abhidharma Buddhists, there is a way to reach a positive answer, and that's through meditation, not through armchair philosophy. But as we'll see, meditation is not a way to get a positive answer either for the Middle Way Buddhists. For them, trying to figure out an answer is bad. There's this famous commentary text for the Middle Way Buddhists called the Mula Madhyamaka Karika. And we'll take a look at one of its verses to see what it says about trying to figure out what exists. So here's the verse. To say it exists is to grasp for existence. To say it does not exist is to adopt the view of nihilism. Therefore, a wise person does not say exists or does not exist. So basically, the Middle Way Buddhism is a rejection of the Abhidharma Buddhist project, which says only the dharmas are real and macroscopic objects like people are illusory and unreal. Middle Way Buddhism simply doesn't care about this project of the Abhidharma Buddhists. So for the Abhidharma Buddhists, it's no to a self, no to not self, no to both self and not self, and no to neither self nor not self. Instead, it's dharmas. But for the Middle Way Buddhists, it's not only no to all four options with the self, it's also no to all the options with the dharmas too. But various Buddhists that interpreted the Mahayana didn't like these ideas of the middle way Buddhists either. So there was another Indian school of Mahayana Buddhism called the Yogacara, which can be translated to as mind only. So I'll be calling the Yogacara Buddhists the mind only Buddhists from now on. The mind only Buddhism seems to be a form of Mahayana Buddhism that did want to think about what we can know is physically real. And as the name suggests, these mind-only Buddhists seem to think that the only things we can know for sure are real are our minds. There is some scholarly debate about whether the mind-only Buddhists were philosophical physical idealists. A physical idealist is someone who thinks that only our minds are physically real, while our bodies in the world of objects do not exist. I can't say I know for sure whether mind-only Buddhism is a form of physical idealism or not, but I have seen one good argument that suggests maybe they really are physical idealists. So the argument about them being physical idealists is this. So the Abhidharma Buddhist dharmas theory not only has subatomic particles, but also has mental aggregates that are believed to be dharmas. So then, Abhidharma Buddhists believe in these two types of building blocks that make up the world: physical subatomic particles and foundational mental aggregates. However, in mind-only Buddhism, they exclude the physical subatomic particles from their list of dharmas and only include the mental aggregates in their list of dharmas. So, maybe the mind-only Buddhism is physical idealism. It could also be that the mind-only Buddhists are not physical idealists, but instead they are epistemological idealists. Epistemology is the study of how someone can be sure about what they know. And an epistemological idealist is someone who is agnostic about whether the outside physical world exists or not, but they feel certain that our minds do exist. It's very much like the Western philosophy of Descartes, who famously said, "I think, therefore I am," which can more specifically be translated as, "I think, therefore I exist." Even if we are brains in vats or victims plugged into the Matrix, we know we exist because we think, is the point of Descartes' saying. Now, some of you might be wondering back to the Middle Way school of Buddhism. If Middle Way Buddhism is saying that a person shouldn't say something exists, or that something does not exist, how is this not some sort of nihilism? Nihilism is the belief that something is non-existent or meaningless. So a physical nihilist, for example, is someone who thinks that physical reality does not exist. So is Middle Way Buddhism some type of nihilism? Well, this is my personal opinion, which may be wrong, and I admit it's not a typical standard textbook answer, but I do think that Middle Way Buddhism can be a type of nihilism. Many people will argue that Middle Way Buddhism is not nihilism, and I think to an extent that is true if we define nihilism as the view that nothing physically exists. This is because Middle Way Buddhism would not say something is non-existent nor existent. So technically, yes, Middle Way Buddhism isn't that kind of nihilism that says nothing physically exists. But I think it is a kind of nihilism that says all views and statements are meaningless. As it seems, according to Middle Way Buddhism, we can never know for sure if something is real or unreal. However, I do think there's a certain kind of Middle Way Buddhism that can't escape more from nihilism. So over time, two interpretations of Middle Way Buddhism came about. One interpretation said that while objective truth or objective reality may not ever be absolutely known or absolutely provable, it can be known or proven conventionally. The other interpretation of Middle Way Buddhism instead proposed that objective truth or objective reality can never be known or proven either absolutely or conventionally. An example I like to use to explain this complex philosophy is abstract mathematics. It's obviously objectively true that 1 plus 1 always equals 2. It doesn't matter what time period it is, what culture you're in, or what kind of person you are. 1 plus 1 always equals 2 when you do the math abstractly. But let's say you're adding a physical thing to another physical thing, like 2 pieces of chocolate. Let's also say one piece of the chocolate is smaller than the other piece. Do I really have 2 pieces of chocolate if one piece is of a smaller size? Or is it more like I have 1.5 pieces of chocolate? You can see how a physical example of 1 plus 1 might get murky, but when you abstractly add 1 plus 1, like on a calculator, it will always equal 2. So the 1 plus 1 in the chocolate scenario maybe can be argued that's not exactly 2. But when you add 1 plus 1 on a whiteboard or a piece of paper, it will always equal 2. So the Middle Way Buddhists who say objective truth can be known or proven conventionally, I think are like the people who say 1 plus 1 always equals 2 abstractly. But maybe you could argue for alternative explanations in a case like our chocolate scenario. But the Middle Way Buddhists who say objective truth cannot be known or proven conventionally, I presume, make a serious philosophical error. In order for the idea that objective truth cannot work even conventionally, I think you would have to argue that 1 plus 1 doesn't always equal 2 abstractly. So then, I think the Middle Way Buddhists that admit objective truth conventionally might not be nihilists, while the Middle Way Buddhists who do not admit to objective truth conventionally are nihilists. Language is another good example of objective truth working conventionally. Words have to have objective meanings. Otherwise, language goes to hell and we can't communicate with each other anymore if any word can mean absolutely anything. It may be true that our words don't exist objectively in a literal sense, but they have to exist objectively in a conventional sense, or else our words become useless. Various Buddhists would have a problem with the Middle Way Buddhists, such as the Abhidharma Buddhists and the Mind-Only Buddhists. This idea of Middle Way Buddhism that nothing can ever be objectively true or objectively real, either absolutely or if you go the more extreme route, even conventionally, this idea is known as emptiness. Emptiness in Middle Way Buddhism signifies that everything lacks something. And that something that these things lack is a kind of truth or existence that works in all contexts. Instead, things can only be said to be true sometimes, or to be real sometimes, or in some contexts, but never to be true or real at all contexts. Paradoxically, the Middle Way Buddhism not only says this about all competing philosophical views, but Middle Way Buddhism even says this about their own view of emptiness itself. Emptiness, too, is better characterized as being empty, rather than as being always true or always real. Consider these passages from that Middle Way Buddhist text I mentioned earlier, the Mula Madhyamaka Karika. It is empty is not to be said, nor it is non-empty, nor that it is both, nor that it is neither. Each is said only for the sake of instruction. Emptiness is taught by the conquerors as the expedient to get rid of all views. But for those whom emptiness is a view have been called incurable. Obviously, this is a difficult to accept idea of Middle Way Buddhism. Personally, for me, I favor the Abhidharma Buddhism to the Middle Way Buddhism. But at the same time, I do think Middle Way Buddhism is acknowledging something that is serious to consider. If you remember my part 1 video on Abhidharma Buddhism, you'll remember that the Abhidharma Buddhists say that the macroscopic world is not actually real, only the atomic dharmas are real. So this means that macroscopic things like mountains, people, dogs, and so on are imaginary constructs, and all those things are really heaps of these building block physical and mental dharmas. I think in many ways, this Abhidharma idea is refreshing. It can be very liberating to realize that we are all made out of the same subatomic parts. Just imagine if we could literally realize this when we meet different people. Things like racism would end immediately. But at the same time, there are potential problems in Abhidharma Buddhism too. And it turns out that in the history of Buddhism, the Abhidharma did have issues arise. For one thing, many Abhidharma Buddhists did not agree on how long each of the building block dharmas exist. For example, there were Abhidharma Buddhists who thought that the dharmas existed eternally, but then there were other Abhidharma Buddhists who thought that the dharmas could not be eternal, since one of the core teachings of Buddhism is impermanence. So then these latter Abhidharma Buddhists thought that the dharmas must be impermanent too, and therefore the dharmas are not eternal. In fact, there were early Buddhists who thought that each and every dharma only lasts for a millisecond before becoming annihilated and then being replaced by a new dharma. With this in mind, it's estimated that there were about 18 different schools of Buddhism in the Abhidharma tradition, and each of these schools having different views from one another on various philosophical issues in Buddhism. I think all these disagreements between the different Abhidharma schools is what gave rise to Middle Way Buddhism in the first place. Since the Abhidharma Buddhist schools had debates about different views, Middle Way Buddhism came about as a type of Buddhism that wanted to end these debates by denying all possible views. It actually makes perfect sense, as you can see this play out in Buddhism. Since the Abhidharma Buddhists were saying either the dharmas are eternal or they're not eternal, obviously big fights were coming about this. So Middle Way Buddhism tried to make a peace treaty by, instead of supporting one or the other, it just denounces both in all possible views. But I think this is a dangerous move by Middle Way Buddhism. If it is going to deny all possible views, then I think this means that there can't really be any truth, and there can't be any way of assessing whether one view is more true or more false than another. It could be something like a pandemic. Either there's a virus that is real and we need to quarantine, or the virus maybe is real but it's not that serious so we don't need to quarantine, or the virus isn't real at all so there's just no need to quarantine and have a pandemic protocol. Obviously, one of these views has to be more true than the others. To say that there is no truth or all views are just no, so no to all three of those possible views, is dangerous. Alas, though, what is Buddhism to make for this conundrum? We've seen how different Abhidharma schools had debates and discussions over philosophical issues. So these issues may be ones that need to be resolved, but how can Buddhism do that? Obviously, we probably don't want to accept Middle Way Buddhism, which just says no to all those views and all possible views. But if we're not to accept Middle Way Buddhism, how do we resolve these conflicts in the Abhidharma Buddhism? Well, this is the perfect opportunity now for Tiantai Buddhism. Tiantai Buddhism draws a lot of similarity from Middle Way Buddhism, such as the Middle Way's emphasis on emptiness, which is the idea that any proposition or view lacks having a firm ground in all contexts. However, instead of Tiantai making emptiness this elaborate deconstruction tool that is very negative like Middle Way Buddhism does, Tiantai instead uses emptiness to be a construction process. What I mean is this. For Middle Way Buddhism, it deconstructs every possible view and truth claim that there is. Middle Way Buddhism does its best to try and find a context or reason for which a claim is false, as it's always looking to say no to every single proposition. But in Tiantai Buddhism, it does the opposite. Instead of Tiantai always saying no to every possible philosophical question or statement, the Tiantai says yes. Is it the case that after death a Buddha exists? Yes. After death, does a Buddha not exist? Yes. After death, does a Buddha both exist and not exist? Yes. After death, does a Buddha neither exist nor cease to exist? Yes.
Do you want to make a covenant? The word is yes, Carl.
Yes! Yes! Yes!
But wait a second. How can there be a yes to all four of these questions? If it's yes to all four, then that inherently implies that no would also be true. The problem appearing before us is that it seems that Tiantai Buddhism is supporting the idea that all views and statements are true, even ones that totally contradict their opposites. For instance, the ball is red, the ball is not red. How can both of these statements be true? It seems that either the ball is always red or the ball is never red. How can it be both red and not red for the ball? Well, I think this is a serious problem we have to consider. This idea that all statements, including ones that totally contradict each other, are true is known in Western philosophy as trivialism. Although there are different levels on the spectrum of trivialism. For instance, there can be minimal trivialism and absolute trivialism. Minimal trivialism is the view that every proposition has a truth value in at least one context, while absolute trivialism is the view that every proposition has a truth value in all contexts. Do you notice the difference? Minimal trivialism is not saying that all statements are equally true. It's just saying that all statements can be true in at least one specific situation, while absolute trivialism is the radical view that every statement is equally true, which is to say that all statements are true in all contexts. I would argue that the more extreme absolute trivialism is not supported by the Tiantai, as Tiantai Buddhism wouldn't go so far as to say that all statements are equally true in all contexts. So then, I would argue that Tiantai Buddhism instead goes for the minimal trivialism view. But even with minimal trivialism, how can that possibly be sensible? Going back to the red ball example, it seems that either the ball is always red or the ball is never red. How can there be a context where the ball is red and a context where the same ball is not red? This thought experiment with the red ball may seem like a conundrum that is impossible to solve. However, think about how any macroscopic object is also a collection of subatomic particles. In Tiantai Buddhism, both views are true, but their truth values depend upon what context from which you are looking at the ball. From the macroscopic context, the ball is obviously red. However, in the subatomic context, the ball is a collection of particles that reflect and absorb a certain number of the wavelengths of light, making the ball appear red macroscopically. Alternatively, if the ball's particles were to absorb all the wavelengths of light and not reflect any of them, then the ball would appear black macroscopically. So then, the subatomic particles are colorless, without the wavelengths of light. But when the wavelengths of light are introduced, the particles of any object will then emit a certain color based upon how much light the particles absorb or don't absorb. This is a perfect example of minimal trivialism. So I think you could sort of argue that in a subatomic context, the ball maybe isn't red, while in the macroscopic context, the ball is clearly red. The other absolute trivialism would simply mean that in all situations, the ball can be both red macroscopically and not red macroscopically, or red subatomically and not red subatomically. This sort of trivialism is clearly hard to reconcile, and probably it is impossible to ever do so. Okay, so Tiantai Buddhism is not a radical trivialism. But still, what about the debates from Abhidharma Buddhism that I mentioned earlier? If you don't recall and forgot what I said before, the various early Buddhist schools had debates about the exact physical nature over the dharmas. One Abhidharma school in particular said that the physical dharmas last in the past, present, and future. In other words, the physical dharmas persist in existence through time. But alternatively, many of the other early and Abhidharma Buddhist schools said that the physical dharmas only last for split moments before they annihilate and then get replaced by new physical dharmas, repeating this process of arising and annihilating over and over again. So, which one of these different views is right? This seems like a question that we should look in contemporary science, in quantum physics though, to see what the answer might be. But wait a minute, hold on here. Does actual quantum physics actually say anything similar to Buddhist atomism? Well, you might be surprised by this as I was, but it turns out that to an extent the answer is yes, although the Buddhist atomic theories do differ from actual quantum physics in substantial ways. But anyway, it turns out that empty space, so a region of space that does not even have any particles or radiation in it, can be a place where tons of these subatomic particles that are called virtual particles blink in and out of existence. Take that in for a moment. Doesn't this sound just like that early school of Buddhism that said the physical dharmas only last for a split instant before annihilating and then being replaced by a new physical dharma, repeating the same process? It just fascinates me that at least this specific notion lines up in both early Buddhist atomic theories and actual quantum mechanics. Whether Buddhist atomism is actually true or not, and whether early Buddhists could actually detect subatomic particles somehow, I honestly don't know. It could be this was all just armchair philosophy and guessing. All I do know is that somehow some of the early Buddhists came up with this notion that there are subatomic particles that pop in and out, and quantum mechanics has proven at least this notion to be true. Now, here's something else that's super interesting. Those virtual particles, once they arise, usually just blink out of existence. But sometimes, those virtual particles can have certain numerical properties that give them the ability to not annihilate, and instead they become what's called real particles, which are subatomic particles that last extendedly through time. So it's like both of the early Buddhist schools were partly right. It wasn't the case that only one could be right while the other was wrong. Subatomic particles can either exist for brief moments before annihilating, or they can become real particles, meaning they become particles that exist for a long time. This is just so exciting to me how quantum physics and Buddhist atomism have some overlap. This makes me want to study quantum physics more one day. Perhaps actual quantum physics could help us better understand where the Buddhist philosophy is correct and where the Buddhist philosophy is wrong about quantum mechanics, like it has with the topic of how long the particles can exist. The situation we have where it's true that subatomic particles can last both for a long time and for short instances makes me think of the minimal trivialism idea with Tiantai Buddhism. Quantum mechanics is so weird at how both ideas can be true. and that just sounds so Tiantai Buddhist. There is one other thing I want to talk about with Tiantai Buddhism, and its philosophy that any idea can be true or that any idea can be real. The thing I'm thinking of is the subject that I think all religions have to ponder over, and that is the subject of evil, and does evil exist? Well, in Tiantai Buddhism, evil is said to be existent. In fact, Tiantai Buddhism says that evil is just as real as good. Good and evil seem to be polar opposites, yet mutual inclusions of each other in Tiantai thought. In other words, without evil, there is no good, and vice versa. There's also this famous quote by a Tiantai Buddhist named Jili, and this quote of his even goes to the extent of saying that the Buddha and the devil are entailed to each other. This is his quote in its original Chinese, which can be translated into English as, outside the devil, there is no Buddha. Outside the Buddha, there is no devil. There is some scholarly debate about what this quote exactly means and what Tiantai Buddhism means by entailing good and evil in each other. I'll go ahead and just offer my interpretation of this Tiantai idea. And what I think it's saying is this: the typically good actions can be done with the utmost evil, while the typically evil actions can be done with the utmost good. To put it another way, the greatest evils can be disguised as the ultimate good, and the greatest of the good can take something that's typically deemed evil and yet find a way to make this specific thing good. Here's a picture of several different Thai Buddhist monks who were caught committing human trafficking. It may have seemed like these monks were good people, but they were not really good, of course. This is just one of the many examples of how what can seem to be of the utmost good can actually be of the utmost evil. And to me, it feels like it's the worst kind of evil because people were probably going to these Buddhist monks thinking they were a source of help, but really they were just a medium used to commit terrible atrocities. For me, it always feels like the worst evil is of the kind that disguises itself as something good so that it can advance an evil agenda. And then for the good and the evil, how can the good take something that is normally deemed evil and turn it into good? An example that immediately comes to my mind is an undercover law enforcement agent. Undercover agents will often go undercover as drug dealers and participate in recreational use of extremely dangerous drugs, but they are doing this for very good reasons. They're doing this to make the real drug dealers trust in them so that the agents can eventually have these dangerous drug dealers caught and taken to prison. This idea of evil and good entailed in each other also reminds me of this one scene in The Matrix Revolutions when Neo goes to visit the Oracle. In this scene, the following dialogue occurs.
Everything that has a beginning has an end. I see the end coming. I see the darkness spreading. I see death. And you are all that stands in his way.
Smith.
Very soon, he's going to have the power to destroy this world, but I believe he won't stop there. He can't. He won't stop until there's nothing left at all.
What is he?
He is you. Your opposite, your negative. The result of the equation trying to balance itself out.
And if I can't stop him?
One way or another, Neo, this war is going to end. Tonight, the future of both worlds will be in your hands or in his.
So then, we can think of Neo as like the Buddha and Smith as like the devil. Both exist and are entailed to each other. Even more so, Neo and Smith are in a way basically each other. They are each other's opposite. And we see at the end of the third Matrix film, The Matrix Revolutions, that Neo accepts Smith, making Neo become another clone of Smith himself. But the obvious question to this action of Neo's is why? Why couldn't Neo just defeat Smith and then somehow undo the Smith virus and make everyone become themselves again? I don't know this for sure, but I think the reason why the Wachowskis didn't have this kind of ending in the Matrix series is due to the fact that the Wachowskis wanted to stick to the Tiantai Buddhist-like and Taoist-like philosophy that existence is an entailment of opposites. Without good, there is no evil, and vice versa. So what this means is that if Neo really wanted to destroy Smith for the rest of eternity and never have Smith return ever again, then Neo would also have to destroy himself. But obviously, we see Smith return in the fourth Matrix movie, The Matrix Resurrections, so what's up with that? Plus, of course, Neo returns too. So when Neo accepts letting Smith's virus take over him, does this mean that Neo accepted Smith destroying him? I don't think so. I think instead of Neo's choice being destruction, it was more like Neo's choice was a restart. In other words, in order to return the Matrix back to normal, stop the Smith virus, and have people return to their original selves, I think Neo had to let Smith transform him. Now, the obvious question is, why would Neo have to do this in order to do all the good stuff that I previously mentioned? To be honest, I'm not sure I fully understand this plot element myself, but I do have some ideas that might make this weird plot twist make more sense. Something that I think will really help for starters is to think of a magnet. A magnet has two sides, a north side and a south side. And the north side repels other north sides but attracts south sides, and vice versa for the south side. So a north side can never connect to another north side, and a south side can never connect to another south side. But what if we cut the magnet in half, splitting the north side from the south end? What would happen to the magnet? Would we truly separate the two sides from each other? The answer is actually no. Instead, we would just now have two magnets rather than having a north side all by itself and a south end all by itself. So this means that if we want to destroy one of the sides, let's say the south end, then we have to destroy the north too. In other words, we have to destroy the whole magnet if we want to destroy the south side. There just simply is no way we can just have the north side alone. Similarly, maybe Neo is like the north end of a magnet, and that's why they gave him a name with N at the beginning, and Smith is like the south, hence his S in his name. And since a magnet can never be made to be one-sided, maybe similarly, the Matrix can never just contain Neo existing without Smith, and the Matrix can never just have Smith existing without Neo. If you want to truly destroy one of them, let's say Smith, then you have to destroy the whole Matrix, which would destroy Smith, but it would also destroy Neo and the entire Matrix itself. Obviously, Neo doesn't want to destroy the entire Matrix, as that would make his mission of saving the world a failure. So he has to find another option. And it seems that the only other option is that Neo has to let Smith inject his cloning virus into him. This means then that, ironically, Smith attempting to get rid of Neo by cloning him ruins Smith's whole plan of taking over the Matrix. By Smith making Neo another clone, Smith caused the whole Matrix to restart itself back to its original form. So maybe the scene of Smith giving the cloning virus to Neo is akin to a south-ended magnet connecting to a north-ended magnet, which would make things come back to order again. There's one other thing I thought about with Neo letting Smith give him his cloning virus that connects to computer science. Maybe since Neo is represented as one, he can be thought of as like a string of code of only ones. And since Smith is his opposite, maybe Smith is a string code of zeros. And everything on a computer screen, from something like the letter A to a more complex picture of a person's face, is just a combination of codes of zeros and ones. This would mean that when Smith infects someone with his cloning virus, he makes that individual become a string code of zeros too. But when Smith finally gets to clone Neo, instead of his plan working to perfection, it instead backfires. Maybe this is because by Smith's virus entering Neo's body, Neo's string of ones intersected with Smith's string of zeros, and this makes all the zeros and ones connect to each other, causing every person to return to themselves in the Matrix and not be a Smith clone anymore. I hope this makes sense, as it is super complicated. There is one other thing out of all this that I think is important to discuss, and that's how Neo came to be able to be willing to let Smith take him over with his virus. Neo would have never done this had Trinity survived that plane crash, but obviously that doesn't happen, and Trinity does die from it. We could maybe say that this scene of Trinity dying is akin to a Buddhist symbolism of non-attachment, and so by Trinity dying, Neo is forced to have to let her go. But then again, Neo and Trinity's relationship returns in the Matrix Resurrections, so Neo doesn't exactly come to a complete non-attachment then. Instead, his desire for Trinity did have to be put down for some time, but then he was able to fulfill his desire for Trinity later, as he does in the Matrix Resurrections. So what's going on? I think maybe the Wachowskis were trying to show another Tiantai Buddhist symbolism here, or more broadly a general Mahayana Buddhist symbolism. And that is the idea that there are times for fulfilling our desires, and there are times for letting go of our desires. But maybe even though there are times for letting go, that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to let go of these desires of ours forever, such as our love for our partner. In fact, some Western philosophers, like this guy, Friedrich Nietzsche, have accused Buddhism of being too denouncing of desire, such as the kind you would have for your romantic partner. I would say Abhidharma Buddhism does in the end deny romantic love, since the nuns and monks in Abhidharma forms of Buddhism are trying to come to the ability of seeing the dharmas, which would put an end to them having physical desires, like being with someone in a marriage. After all, if you can see that everything from a rock to a person's face is just made of the same subatomic particles, and that's the only true view of reality, then there really is no desire for romance anymore. However, as I showed and explained earlier, Tiantai Buddhism has a unique Buddhist perspective in regards to desire. We've seen how Abhidharma Buddhism says no to all views except for the view of the subatomic particles and mental aggregates, also known as the dharmas. So when it comes to the dharmas, there is finally a yes in Abhidharma Buddhism. But then Middle Way Buddhism came along and said no to all views, including the views of the dharmas and even Middle Way Buddhism itself. However, when Tiantai Buddhism comes around, it says yes to all views, as Tiantai tries to construct all views and find a context where each individual view could be true. This is not to say that every view by default is equally true, but Tiantai Buddhism does seem to say that there is always a possible context where any single view could be true. So I think the idea of Neo having a desire for Trinity is also very Tiantai Buddhist-like. And I think Tiantai could also be a Buddhist answer to the kinds of problems Friedrich Nietzsche worried about, with nihilism being too close to being a core philosophy in various religions, including Buddhism. Very briefly, Friedrich Nietzsche accused both Buddhism and Christianity of having elements of nihilism in them. Both religions offer a transcendental realm to the ordinary world, and for Christianity, that's heaven, while for Buddhism, it's nirvana. Since both religions seem to offer a world that devalues our ordinary lives, Nietzsche thought this inevitably leads people to nihilism. Another reason Nietzsche saw nihilism in both religions is because both seem to prescribe a type of denial of our desires. For Buddhism, it's denying any desire we have for physical things of this world, like a marriage with another person, having material wealth, and so on, while for Christianity, we are told to always deny our own desires in favor of God's will. So Nietzsche saw both of these religions promoting world denial and self-denial. Now, it's easy to figure out what heaven is in Christianity, but some of you might be wondering what nirvana is in Buddhism. Well, we've seen in my part 1 video of this series that nirvana in early Abhidharma Buddhism seems to be a coming to the ability of seeing the dharmas by way of meditation. And then, once that meditative state of seeing the dharmas has been reached, we can then let go of all the macroscopic phenomena we gravitate towards with an attachment, such as our fancy car, for instance. And the reason for this is because when we see that all macroscopic objects are made out of the same subatomic parts, then we realize that these macroscopic objects don't really exist, and only the dharmas truly exist. But there's also this Buddhist term called parinirvana, which translates into English as something like awakening without remainder. But what is this awakening without remainder? Is parinirvana a kind of annihilation of experience and it's just nothingness? And that's how all our physical desires end? Well, it turns out in early Buddhism there is a split on this matter of what parinirvana is. Some early Buddhist schools do assert that parinirvana is a mentally lights out of nothingness. So when the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, achieved nirvana, he still had his life to live, but upon his death and into his parinirvana, he ceased to exist. However, there are other early Buddhist thinkers and early Buddhist schools that promote the assertion that parinirvana is not a lights out nothingness, but instead, parinirvana is just an experience that only pertains to consciousness. What this means is that even the physical dharmas must be let go of in this line of Buddhist thinking. So this entails that even seeing everything as a heap of physical dharmas is not good enough to enter parinirvana. Instead, we have to give up everything physical, including the physical dharmas, and instead only live as a collection of mental dharmas. So, in this latter line of early Buddhist thinking, there is conscious experience even in parinirvana, so it's not nothingness. But parinirvana in this line of thought is not experienced as anything physical anymore. Rather, it's an experience of being only mental dharmas. But both of those views, whether it's nothingness or just conscious experience, are early Buddhism. So what about Tiantai Buddhism? What is parinirvana for the Tiantai? Well, it turns out that for Tiantai Buddhism, nirvana and parinirvana are not the same as they are in earlier forms of Buddhism. In fact, there's this idea in all of Mahayana Buddhism, not just Tiantai, that it's best to become a Buddhist agent who helps others reach nirvana when you achieve nirvana, rather than just getting nirvana and then ultimately parinirvana just for yourself. And Tiantai Buddhism furthers this idea by saying that nirvana is actually just an eternal mission of trying to get other beings to experience nirvana. And in Tiantai, it actually goes so far to say that there is no parinirvana. Instead, parinirvana was an earlier teaching of the Buddha just to help people overcome their immorality, but not a literal state and goal to be achieved. So then, Tiantai's goal is not to come to a state of nothingness, nor a state of leaving this world to only experience the mental dharmas. In fact, for Tiantai Buddhism, their vision of nirvana is a state of being an eternal returner to the ordinary world, to help others experience all the joys of life, basically, and, of course, spirituality. With all of this being the case about Tiantai Buddhism, maybe this is how Neo can be like a Buddha, even though he has a lover with Trinity. In other words, maybe Neo is more like a Tiantai Buddhist Buddha rather than an Abhidharma Buddhist Buddha. Plus, when you think about that important architect scene in The Matrix Reloaded, Neo is confronted with a choice to make between two doors. This scene can be very hard to follow, but the point of it is that Neo either chooses one door, which leads him to saving all the people unplugged from the Matrix before the Matrix system itself crashes and has to be rebooted, which will kill everyone who's plugged into the Matrix. Or Neo chooses the other door, which leads to the human city of Zion having to go head-to-head in a final battle between the machines. Now, Neo would normally choose the first door, which is to save the people who are unplugged, but the only problem is Trinity happens to be plugged into the Matrix at the same time that Neo is talking with the architect. So, this means that if Neo chooses to save only the unplugged people, then Trinity will have to die since she's plugged in. So, Neo decides not to choose the first door, but to choose the other door, which leads to a head-on final battle with the machines. And this will probably kill everyone unplugged, which means there will no longer be a free human race from the Matrix. And he makes this choice for obvious reasons. He wants to save Trinity and have her not die. And the architect mocks Neo for his weakness and desire for Trinity. The architect infers that because Neo is trying to save Trinity, he will end up destroying Zion, of course, along with Neo most likely himself and Trinity, so to the architect it seems like a lost cause. However, the architect was wrong because we know at the end of the Matrix Revolutions, Neo does end the war between the humans and the machines, thus saving sentient life not just in Zion, but also the machines. So, Neo did everything right when you think about it, because had he chosen the other door, he would not only have killed Trinity, but he would also restart the whole slavery process with the Matrix, which would be an ending much worse than the ending we see in the Matrix Revolutions. It's really neat thinking about all of these different forms of Buddhism. We started out with Abhidharma Buddhism, and how the Abhidharma thought that physical reality can be logically determined to where only the subatomic dharmas exist. But macroscopic reality does not exist. So in Abhidharma Buddhism, it's no to macroscopic reality, but yes to the subatomic dharmas. But then we transitioned to Middle Way Buddhism, which said that all reality, including physical reality, is empty, meaning that physical reality is logically indeterminable. So in Middle Way Buddhism, it's no to macroscopic reality, no to the subatomic dharmas and the mental aggregate dharmas, and just no all the way down. After that, we then went on to mind-only Buddhism, which said no to the physical dharmas, but yes to the mental dharmas. And then finally, we ended with Tiantai Buddhism, which said yes to all kinds of different views. So in Tiantai, it's yes to macroscopic reality, yes to the subatomic dharmas and the mental aggregate dharmas, and yes to all sorts of other different views. I'm sure all of you are curious as to what I think and most identify with between all of these different Buddhist traditions. Well, personally, I most identify with the Tiantai Buddhist tradition. as I see that reality can be described and logically determined in all kinds of different ways. But I'm curious as to what all of you think. Do you think Buddhism makes most sense in the Abhidharma, Middle Way, Mind Only, or Tiantai interpretation? If you're up to it, let me know in the comments below. It was a lot of fun creating this video, and I hope you all enjoyed it. Until next time.
Everything's okay now.
Look!
Just look at that. Beautiful. Did you do that?
For now.
That's nice. I know he'd love it.
Will we ever see him again?
I suspect so. Someday.
Did you always know?
Oh, no. No, I didn't. But I believe.